Welcome, everyone. This is TEDxAsburyPark's sixth online salon. Since we can't meet in person, we meet here online. I feel like I live in this fishbowl. My name is Brian Smiga. With a team of 25 plus folks, we put on TEDxAsburyPark every year to a full house. It's an all-day party where we share ideas from about 25 speakers and entertainers. And since we haven't been able to meet in person for a while, we've been doing these salons. Tonight, we have a great lineup of two of our former TED speakers. First, John Cedaleides, who's a geopolitical strategist who spoke on our stage in Asbury Park in 2017. And tonight, he's giving a talk entitled Cold War II, where he considers that we've already begun a Cold War with China and that there's kind of an inevitable tension and sort of not hot war, but Cold War battle between the United States and its allies and China for dominance in different geographies and different economies. As well as our second speaker, Gary Mottola. Gary Mottola heads up Madison Marquette and has developed the Asbury Park Urban Resurgence and Boardwalk, and was a TED speaker in 2015 at Monmouth University, and then was a co-host for us at the Paramount Theater the last 3 years. Gary, who went to school at Harvard with Timothy Leary as one of his professors in the 60s, then went on to graduate school, law school in Berkeley in the late 60s. He's going to talk about the 60s versus 2020. What's the same? What's different? I think there's some really critical similarities and yet some critical differences in society and discourse in these two periods that are 50 years apart. And that should be a really interesting short talk Gary's giving. Please welcome John Cedaleides. His talk is entitled Cold War II, and we'll see on the other side in about 25 minutes for more discussion after you also hear Gary Mottola's talk. Thanks so much for coming, and see you on the other side.
Brian, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I do want to take advantage of the opportunity to talk about some very serious issues that we're dealing with here in the United States as Americans, with our friends, partners, and allies around the world, and unfortunately, with a growing cadre of adversarial nations in the world at a very, very dangerous time in this early part of the 21st century. And it's why I've titled my presentation Cold War II, China Beyond US Elections, because we're in a very bad place right now, given the direction that China has taken since the ascension to power of General Secretary Xi Jinping. So I'd like to start, first of all, with this beautiful graphic. It's a satellite photo of planet Earth. And besides admiring the fact that the terrestrial part of the planet is only 30%, 70% of the world's surface is oceans, waterways, and seas. And it's on this 70% of oceans, waterways, and seas that the global economy is able to properly function and operate. You see here in this graphic the shipping lanes that connect major markets and major countries around the world. And about 90% of the world's trade, global commerce, takes place on our oceans in free and protected open shipping lanes defended by the United States, our Navy, and those navies of our allies and partners around the world. And this is a paramount foundation of the rules-based international order that the United States helped to establish 70 years ago in the wake of the sheer catastrophes of World War II in both Europe and Asia, to see to it that there was no regional hegemon that would threaten the regional balance in Europe or in Asia, or for that matter, any other part of the world, so that we're all able to share in an increasingly peaceful and prosperous world. And that has been the case for the better part of the last 70 years. We don't know if that will be the case going forward because of decisions that we see emanating in Beijing in recent years and really moving forward without any end in sight. So we move to this terrific snapshot of the global economy. And we see here how the US and China really are the two largest economies in the world. But it really took off in China with the ascension of China, with US push, a major diplomatic effort on the part of the US, a bipartisan consensus of the Clinton and Bush administrations to welcome China into the World Trade Organization. And what we didn't realize was that the Chinese Communist Party had no intention of becoming a quote unquote responsible stakeholder, and instead moved in a very different direction than what we in the United States and our Western partners had expected. But I want to emphasize, ladies and gentlemen, that this is not an unprecedented position for China near the top of the global economy. It's important to note that historically, China has been the largest economy in the world for almost 1,800 of the last 2,000 years. And this graphic offers a splendid snapshot of just how dominant the Chinese economy was until about the early 1800s. And what you had taking place historically on a global scale at that time was sort of a triple overlay of significant developments. One was the continued advancement of free market capitalist systems that really took off several centuries earlier in the Dutch state and in the Italian city-states, but came to fruition in the late 1700s, overlaid by the rise of political democracy and more consensual government, starting in the British Empire in the late 1600s, of course, the American Revolution in the late 1700s, and then increasingly national revolutions in Europe in the early 1800s. And on top of all of this came the Industrial Revolution. And what China sees right now is an opportunity to restore itself to its rightful place atop the global economy. And it's very difficult to dispute this with China because they were there for 1,800 years. They see this as their natural place. They're determined to achieve it. And there's no argument on the part of the United States or our Western partners, except for the way in which they're seeking to accomplish this. One of the mainstays of the Chinese policy was launched in 2013 under General Secretary Xi, and it's known as the Belt Road Initiative, which is a geographic replication of the famous trade routes between Asia and Europe. And instead of having a maritime supply chain empire, it's a surface transportation supply chain empire across Eurasia, across the Middle East, and then by sea to South Asia, Africa, and eventually to European ports. And China has been able to successfully export excess industrial capacity and an excess labor pool. And the idea here is not only to be able to export this excess capacity, but to achieve tremendous political influence by making Chinese credit available to underdeveloped countries that would otherwise have a difficult time accessing credit on international markets. But in exchange for offering that credit, China imposes onerous terms under opaque agreements. And when these recipient countries have a difficult time repaying Chinese banks or institutions or state-owned enterprises, we either have a situation where China demands sovereign assets in exchange for the inability to repay the terms, or more insidiously, political influence in those capitals so that criticism of China for its notorious human rights violations, its violations of international environmental and labor standards are muted by these countries. They shy away from criticism, and China is able to operate with greater impunity on the world stage as a result of the political influence it secured by building these projects and making this kind of access, capital access available to these poorer, underdeveloped countries. Now, as we just described, the Silk Roads of Marco Polo fame across Eurasia, and there's also a maritime belt component to it, as we mentioned, where the Chinese government is promoting the construction of new ports and harbors and facilities, essentially to connect Chinese markets to sources of natural resources, especially in Africa and in South Asia. We also see China looking at what's happening in the North Pole with the warming waters of the Arctic Ocean. And so China is working very closely with its junior partner, Russia, to establish brand new shipping lanes that would cut about 25 to 35% of the time that it takes to ship containers from East Asia to European ports. And so we'll look to see how Russia is able to fortify these shipping lanes and work with China so that they're able to marginalize other access to other markets and other countries to these shipping lanes. But China is already looking ahead, not just to connecting with European ports for especially time-sensitive supply chain management, but eventually, as waters might also warm north of Canada, to be able to more speedily access destination markets and consumer markets in the eastern seaboard of North America. So beyond these transportation and infrastructure linkages that China has very successfully built throughout much of the world over the last 6 to 7 years, we also see China asserting greater dominance in an almost belligerent fashion in the South China Sea. But what China has done is unilaterally declare 1.4 million square miles of international waterways and international airways as sovereign Chinese waters and sovereign Chinese airspace. It's a very dangerous precedent for not only the Western Pacific, but for any part of the world where a great power will seek to usurp the territory or the international waters or exclusive economic zones of its neighboring countries and ignore international laws, treaties, and conventions. The concern that we have, ladies and gentlemen, is an accident that spins out of control. We see the possibility of miscalculations that could lead to a kinetic conflict that no one wants to see occur in this very sensitive and very, very dangerous part of the world. Beyond this commercial, economic, and legal activity, or illegal activity, to put it more correctly, we also see a far more robust Chinese military power projection capability in the Western Pacific. Now, this is a problem in that they could threaten the international waterways, which we've described on several occasions here, to provide for free and open shipping that supports the foundations of the global commercial network, the global economy. And I don't believe that China is looking for a military conflict with the United States, but what they are seeking is to deter the United States from being able to credibly defend its interests and those of its allies against a very powerful Chinese military, and to potentially threaten the credibility of the United States to defend the rules-based international order, to defend free and open shipping lanes, and to harm the economic prospects of some of the most important countries in the global economy. So we're very concerned about these developments, and we don't see any turn back anytime soon on the part of a very aggressive Chinese military strategy, again, under the current power of General Secretary Xi. Now, having said all this, we don't want to exaggerate the likelihood of a military conflict in East Asia. A war in East Asia could involve the world's number 2 economy, China, the world's number 3 economy, Japan, the world's 12th largest economy, South Korea, and the world's 20th largest economy, Taiwan. And even pronouncing Taiwan as coming under Chinese control by 2049. This was a speech that General Secretary Xi gave openly, publicly, declaring Taiwan, which China considers to be a rogue province, to be unified with China by the centennial of the rise of the Chinese Communist Party in China, 2049, ideally peacefully, and if not, then by military means. So we're also very much concerned about Chinese military ambitions for a possible amphibious assault on Taiwan sometime in the next 3 to 6 years. But we hope, and we are looking to persuade the Chinese political and military leadership that any such military operations off of its shoreline would be very deleterious to the Chinese economy, to China's society, and to China's continued rise on the world stage. Now, we've been living in a COVID world, ladies and gentlemen, for the last 10 months. And what we've learned beyond the tremendous suffering is also just how vulnerable and just how exposed our supply chains have been to complete dominance by the Chinese economy and therefore by the Chinese government. But we've also come to realize that we have pharmaceutical dependency on China. And if we dig deeper, we realize that many critical parts are also based either wholly or in part in China. So I believe that what you'll see is strategic policies undertaken in Washington, but also in European capitals to reroute valuable supply chains, especially for core critical sectors regarding national security, regarding technology, semiconductors and cloud computing, and also, of course, health and medical supplies. And I think you'll see this taking place, ideally reshoring back into the home country itself where possible. But because of costs, because of logistics, there are some very significant alternatives. The most likely initial candidates for the new supply chain factory floors will likely be in Asia. And I think much of the focus will be on strategic policies emanating from New Delhi. India is the other Asian colossus, 1.3 billion people, the world's largest democracy. And so India is on a trajectory of growth and prosperity in the years and decades ahead. And it's already reaching out to a number of multinational corporations and friendly governments to have them consider India as the new destination for supply chains that will be leaving China. Having said that, most of the supply chains that are in China will likely remain there because it's simply too expensive or too unwieldy to move them out. And you also will have many companies that will probably double down on their investment in China in order to be able to access China's increasingly affluent middle class, now 300 to 400 million Chinese with a lot more cash to spend, and American and Western companies seeking access there. But where there are core critical supply chains that can affect the national well-being and health of Western societies, those are going to have to leave China. So when we talk about the Cold War or Cold War II, where did this come from? It really began, I would say, almost formally in 2015, when General Secretary Xi announced the very ambitious Made in China 2025 strategy. And this strategy declares that China is going to become the globally dominant power, or effectively cyber power and technological power, in 10 of the world's most advanced industrial and technological breakthrough sectors. And China is not doing this as a country guided by an open, democratic, and capitalist system, but instead we see heavy pressure on the scales with targeted quotas, which are an open violation of the World Trade Agreement or the World Trade Organization, to completely tilt the scales in an illegal way. As a member of the WTO, China is not permitted to operate this way. But what they've declared is that they're going to target America's technological leadership, based largely in Silicon Valley and in California, and also Germany's industrial manufacturing dominance. And this is really the shot across the bow from Beijing that was first picked up in the United States. And I believe now that our German partners are beginning to understand that their leading cutting edge industrial manufacturing industries are being outright targeted by China. And this is an area now where we see a coalition of Western countries coming together to come up with free market democratic solutions against these mercantilist, authoritarian strategies emanating from Beijing. So this has begun to play out in what is now a world-famous Huawei strategy led by the United States and increasingly joined by our most valuable and influential allies worldwide. And this is the sense that Huawei is in effect a front company for the Chinese Communist Party ever since Beijing enacted national security laws that declared that any Chinese corporation, firm, private enterprise or state-owned enterprise, institution or citizen, if asked by the Chinese Communist Party to provide access to their collected data and to allow the Chinese Communist Party to access the data of not only hundreds of millions of consumers around the world, but of governments, of government agencies, very sensitive classified data. So just as the US is largely banning Huawei from its 5G systems, we have major allies around the world that are joining the US in banning Huawei, some openly, including Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and others a bit more subtly, such as Germany, which is not naming Huawei by name, but is essentially laying out its new laws so that any high-risk security companies such as Huawei will not be allowed to bid on German telecommunications and infrastructure projects. Now, in the United States, this has gone beyond just Huawei, and it's hit the American consumer market. And there are, unfortunately, probably tens of millions of mostly young people, but I suppose Americans of all ages, who've become accustomed to enjoying TikTok videos. But unless there is a deal to be had with whether it's Microsoft or Oracle or Walmart to be able to control the data servers into which all of the TikTok consumer user data goes, TikTok may be banned in the United States outright. And we see that happening with WeChat already. But the access that these apps and other apps on Chinese app stores allow for the Chinese Communist Party to penetrate for potentially nefarious purposes the consumer data and to hoover up all that data for ultimate purposes against American interests and the interests of those citizens whose data has been exploited is simply too much for any responsible US government to allow to go unchallenged. And we'll see this playing out in other countries around the world in the months and years ahead. And so the US response to much of this nefarious Chinese activity in the realm of technology, and especially of consumer apps and software systems, is to establish a clean network. And it seems to be several months old. It seems to be a fairly well thought out concept of branding, effectively, US and Western systems as clean to use. In other words, safe to use. And whether it's the networks, whether it's the apps, whether it's the app stores, whether it's cloud computing, whether it's the undersea cables that carry this data, if you're part of this clean network, you have safe access to systems, to data, to information, and privacy protections, especially in Europe. But of course, on the other hand, then, if a company or a system is outside the clean network, such as China's Huawei, ZTE, and other 5G companies and technology entities, then they're part of a dirty network. And the US has declared that it will assume that any country that allows those Chinese systems into their infrastructure grids and into the telecommunications networks will be considered dirty networks. And it will also diminish the intelligence sharing that the US government is willing to undertake with those governments. So there are very severe consequences for allowing these Chinese systems into national grids and telecommunications networks. I think it's important to be reminded that China, it is a country that is run by a Chinese Communist Party that maintains rigid ideological adherence to the principles laid out by Vladimir Lenin. And the Cold War seems to be a relic, ladies and gentlemen. We thought we put that away in 1991. And we did when it came to the Soviet Union, which thankfully collapsed at that time. But the Chinese Communist Party learned its lessons from the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they realized that they needed to become a wealthy country and to be able to become a world-class country, as they've declared openly they intend to be. And the one country that stands in the way of China's ambitions is the United States. And so China has launched this Cold War against the US and therefore against the US's Western allies and institutional networks in order to be able to achieve that global dominance by 2049. And it's something we need to be very mindful of whenever we're dealing with Beijing. It cannot be treated as a normal country because it operates within its own system, not only technologically behind its own closed internet, but also in a way that provides for muted criticism of China, increasingly so on the world stage, and creates an environment for very dangerous political influence that really is against the interests of those countries that are participating in this global Chinese campaign. Now, much of the rise of China, and this is where I'll bookend the Cold War discussion, we just talked with Made in China 2025 about what I consider to be the formal launch of the Cold War by China against the West. But I think also it's important that we as Americans and our allies and friends around the world are cognizant of the fact that in order to more deeply invest in China and to build closer US-China ties and Western ties with China so that China could become a more responsible stakeholder in the international order, we were willing to sideline and marginalize the issue of human rights. And I believe in retrospect, that was a grave mistake because part of what it means to be in the West is to respect the dignity and the value of every single human being. But we see, ladies and gentlemen, that by marginalizing human rights for the sake of investment returns, we've created a monster in Asia, where we have a situation today where in the Western Chinese province of Xinjiang, we have the largest concentration camp gathering of a religious minority in the world since World War II, taking place with the Uyghur Muslims. We have now the return of more brutal suppression of the rights of the Buddhist Tibetans in Southwest China. And more recently, we've learned about new repression measures against the Mongolian minority in the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region in northern China. All of this, of course, against the backdrop of the national security laws that were imposed ruthlessly on Hong Kong in 2020, removing the democratic rights and the rights to dissent that the Hong Kong citizens believed were theirs until 2047 under the agreement between the United Kingdom and China, which China apparently has unilaterally abrogated, again, with near impunity on the world stage. You see here in this graph a growing bipartisan consensus, Democrats and Republicans alike coming to understand, because they're better informed now about China's activities within its borders and outside of its borders, about China's very troublesome role on the world stage. And I believe you'll see a number of policies coming out of Washington and leading capitals of our allies and partners worldwide that not only will look to hold China accountable for many of these activities in terms of the Cold War technological competition that we've seen playing out, military aggression in the region, human rights violations, degradation of environmental standards and the like, but I think also in the context of what it means to be a responsible partner on the world stage. And I think most Americans have come to understand that China has become the greatest problem, the greatest threat to the international rules-based order. And I believe we'll be seeing a coalescence of values and a reminder of what it means to be part of the West and how we would look to see that every country we work with helps to emanate those values, those norms, especially centered on respect for the dignity and value of every single human being in a way that the Chinese Communist Party finds utterly antithetical. And so on that, I want to thank you all very much for giving me this platform and this time to describe for you what I see, unfortunately, as a Cold War situation, which is really the creation of the Chinese Communist Party, and the ways in which the US and our Western partners will work together to hopefully dissuade China from continuing to move in this direction and to look to see how the 2020s can be a decade of promise rather than one of peril.
Just got a lot smarter about geopolitics. Thank you, John. I am now privileged to introduce Gary Mottola, and in a change of pace, we're going to focus on domestic conflict and conversation and ideas, contrasting the 60s to 2020. Please welcome our next speaker, Gary Mottola, who'll give a short talk, and then John and Gary will be available for your questions and your commentary.
We live in a time of division and polarization. Seems like everyone must choose a side. Compromise and moderation are not an option. Many have commented on the similarities between the world we live in today and an era from a few generations ago. The late 1960s and early 70s were marked by many of the same divisions we see today. Much was the same, but so much was different in so many ways. Look at 1965, just 20 years after the end of World War II. It was the serene time of Ozzie and Harriet and Leave It to Beaver, leaving the cities and settling the suburbs. The greatest generation which had fought and won the war set our cultural standards. Well-groomed, hair-cropped for men and ballooned for women, respect for authority, teachers, police, and the elderly. But all that changed suddenly and rapidly and with a strength that seemed to be controlled by some otherworldly force. The Civil Rights Act had passed in 1964, but the impact was still limited. In 1965, segregation, actual or de facto, was the norm in most of the country. As for women, they were mostly at home, with so many opportunities in the professions, politics, business, effectively denied. Law school classes were stuck with a female enrollment of less than 5%. Representation by women in Congress was negligible. Businesses were managed almost exclusively by men, and women's athletics were an afterthought. At the time, there was another event lurking in the background. The Cold War led to a foreign policy that was dominated by the perception of an ever-present threat of the expansion of communism. Vietnam, an undeveloped nation in Southeast Asia, had lost to Ho Chi Minh and his followers. The U.S. provided economic aid and advisors to the South, but for many years, Vietnam barely registered on the American consciousness. Then in 1964, Lyndon Johnson committed the first combat troops, and quickly, American military personnel in Vietnam grew to 200,000, and then more than 500,000. And it was an ugly war with pitched battles for hills named for numbers, and daily death tolls announced on the national news. We did not have an all-volunteer army then. There was a draft. Ordinary American boys were being inducted and sent to fight, and sometimes die for a cause that many Americans began to question. Although many white young men were drafted, the burden fell disproportionately on minorities. It seemed like the widespread protests against the war in Vietnam served as a catalyst for empowering and strengthening all of the other movements of the time: civil rights, women's rights, gay rights. And there was a lot of violence, riots in Detroit, LA, Washington, Chicago, Newark. Right here in Asbury Park, much of the west side of the city was burned to the ground. In the early 1970s, there were 5 terrorist bombings a day in the US. But there was also progress. In the recent Democratic debates, we saw Joe Biden and Kamala Harris go at it about Biden's history on desegregation. They were talking about the desegregation efforts of the early 1970s, the first meaningful efforts to integrate schools. From 1969 to 1972, the number of African Americans attending predominantly black schools in the South dropped from 78% to 25%, and schools in the North quickly followed suit. In 1969, Harvard established its African American Studies Department, something that was unthinkable just a few years earlier. Doors opened for women slowly but inexorably. The incoming law school class at Berkeley grew from less than 5% to almost 20% in 1972, and today 65% of the class are women. Historically, from the 20s to the 60s, only 2% or so of the members of Congress were women. But 30 years later, the women who led the feminist movement of the 60s had quintupled representation to over 12%, and today women are a quarter of Congress. It was the passage of Title IX in 1972 that opened the door for women's athletics. At the time, all of these movements collectively dominated the national consciousness. They fed off each other, each adding strength to the others. And at the time, everyone learned what was going on from the same sources: 3 national television networks and a strong national and regional print media. Trusted newscasters like Walter Cronkite and Huntley and Brinkley objectively told us what they were witnessing, and everyone heard it at the same time and in the same way. Contrast that with today, where we all seem to hear only what we want to hear. We tune into cable stations that are married to their ratings base and just reinforce what we already believe. On social media and the internet, we're victims of algorithms that put us into feedback loops that just compound what we're already thinking. Today, we're in a political lockdown. But in the 60s and 70s, despite the continual clouds of protest, there was some political progress and cooperation. During this time, Richard Nixon, a Republican and very polarizing figure, was president. But it was Nixon's Justice Department that pursued the desegregation efforts, and Nixon who signed the bill establishing Title IX. A staunch anti-communist, Nixon surprised the world by opening relations between the US and communist China, and was widely acclaimed for these efforts. But when Nixon's Watergate transgressions became apparent, Republicans crossed to vote with Democrats, leading to Nixon's resignation. Last year, the New York Times issued a report card for the generation of the 60s. It assigned A's for social movement, technology, and pop culture, but near-failing grades for politics and manners. It rightly claimed that our political institutions have become dysfunctional and civic debate has crumbled. And despite the waves of protests 50 years ago, there was a sense of hope, a certainty that everyone would be better off than their parents. And there was even some understanding. In Berkeley, thousands of students and other protesters were arrested and sent to the jail in Santa Rita, and walking to class through clouds of tear gas was not uncommon. But there was a girl who was at every protest. She felt that it was her job to bring flowers to give to the cops.
And thank you all for listening to their great talks. We're lucky to have such observers with us. Appreciate your insights, Gary and John. Can we bring them up here so they're featured on the video? Great. Thank you so much. Keen observations. And I'll start with you, John, but there are some questions from the audience, and I know Gary has some questions for you, John. I guess the way I would put it is I'm a progressive and an optimist. And so while we're entering a conflict and Cold War in a fragile world, it seems like we are in a stronger and more resilient place than we were in the 60s. we have a lot of new threats like AI, genomics, biowarfare, etc. But if you look at the welfare of people across the globe, there's a larger middle class, access to education, basic services, and human rights is often much more prevalent than it was 50 years ago. How does that stage play out in this Cold War or this conflict with China?
That's a great question, Brian. And in some ways, it overlaps with Gary's terrific presentation, giving us a historical sense of how America has progressed over the last half century. Let's keep in mind that during the Cold War period that Gary highlighted, America and the world were grappling with the advent of nuclear weapons, right? So there was never a weapon in the history of mankind that could obliterate the entire species. So they were going through their own sort of crises about technology being used for good, for human progress, and also potentially for evil. So where we are today is not new, right? History tends to repeat itself. We are dealing with a very different world of technologies, as you correctly note, AI and cloud computing and semiconductors and 5G networks, all of which offer the promise of an even greater future of prosperity for the world. And to your point, Brian, sometimes when we talk about many of these geopolitical challenges in one comprehensive presentation, it seems somewhat overwhelming. But these are challenges that in one form or another, the world has been dealing with for decades. Now, they tend to be a bit more concentrated now because of the strategy of the Chinese Communist Party, which was not manifest this way as recently as 10 years ago. But we are living in the most prosperous time in all of human history today. And I'm glad you said what you said. We do have such tremendous leaps forward ahead of us, but look at where we are today with the crushing of human poverty in almost every part of the world. Absolute poverty, that is. There's still much progress that needs to be done. But even in a country like China, you now have 300 to 400 million middle-class citizens in a country that 20 to 30 years ago was an agrarian, backwater, underdeveloped country. And in South Asia and Africa and Latin America, we have people's quality of life rising in ways that were unimaginable only a few decades ago. So there's very good news underlying all of these stories. At the same time, we must be practical. We must be hard-headed about the fact that we are facing great power competition that in many ways, Brian, really is the historical legacy of mankind. That nice 10-year period of the 1990s was really more of an aberration of peace. But unfortunately, most of world history is marked by competition between empires, between nation states. And so we see ourselves in that competition today. The main goal, of course, is to ensure that we're able to enjoy our freedom and our prosperity here in the US and in the West, and to avoid military conflict as a means of maintaining the spectacular quality of life. And the extent to which we work more closely and effectively with our allies and those nation states that share our values and share our objectives, and ideally to even be able to persuade those reformers inside of Beijing that the hardline hyper-nationalist approach under General Secretary Xi is not to China's benefits, because I don't see the dissolution of the Chinese Communist Party anytime in the foreseeable future. It has absolute control over Beijing and all of China's society. And the question is, how do we change the balance inside of Beijing's leadership so that those countries that envision a future of responsible partnership for China come to the ascendance, and those hyper-nationalist enemies of the rules-based international order fall a little bit further down in the chain of command?
Well, that's a tall order. Gary, do you have a question for John, or do you have an observation you want to share?
Yeah, I do have a question. John, can you give us a couple of takeaways on what are really the fundamental things that China is doing so wrong? I mean, I think we all sense it, but when you talk about technology and China trying to, dominate the world in the technology, well, we dominate it now. So, we dominate it now. They want to take our place. That seems fair. And then you look at Google, and Google being sued for antitrust violations and things like listening to someone who said that in the price comparison field, there were many companies that began to develop price comparisons. Google developed its own price comparison business. And when you Google it now, Google, their price comparison comes up number 1, and all the others are number 20 and 30. So Google doesn't seem to have clean hands. If you could name the 3 or 4 things that China is doing that are really wrong, morally, whatever, that would certainly, in my mind, clear up why it is that you think that the competition's not.
I think John has a long list, but let's see what the
Yeah,
top.
I'm sure. Yeah, and I know you mentioned some of them, but it was a little hard for me to distill which ones you think are the most critical inappropriate actions that China is engaging in compared to Google.
Thank you very much, Gary. And I will try to offer as concise an answer as I can and be fair to the question, but also allow for time for any of the questioners. But let me just focus on the centerpiece of my thesis that China has launched a technological Cold War against the United States through its Made in China 2025 strategy. And the problem that I see is, I hope I mentioned clearly in my presentation, Gary, there's not an issue with China seeking to achieve global dominance the way any other country might, except that it's not operating in a free and open competitive marketplace. What separates China from every other leading industrial country is the fact that it is dedicating government resources in a manner that is non-compliant with the World Trade Organization, in effect having their cake and eating it too. When Google or other companies in the United States or in Europe or Japan or South Korea are violating laws, there is a system of rule of law to bring about an anti-monopolist perspective, to ensure that executives are open and transparent with their stakeholders and with their boards and the like. There's nothing of the sort in China. In China, it's a very different system because it's a Communist Party authoritarian system that dictates that any data that, say, a Huawei or an Ant Group or a TikTok would want about its competition around the world, they can go to the Chinese Communist Party, which has all of the data that it's acquired by forced technology transfers, by outright intellectual property theft, and a whole host of very malign activities around the world. And they're able to get that data from the Chinese government, and the Chinese government in return demands that any of these private companies surrender access to data that they've acquired to the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army to be able to achieve their geopolitical, military, and regional objectives. So I think the fundamental difference here, and we can go on for hours, unfortunately, on this, is that China does not operate the way every other country in what we call this liberal, rules-based international order operates. It's exploited its place in the World Trade Organization. And let me just emphasize that the US, when it led this strategy, the Republicans and the Democrats together in a bipartisan consensus, they knew that China had not met all the criteria, and they skipped that process so that China can be welcomed into the WTO with the idea that a wealthier and more prosperous China would eventually become a freer and more consensual and more democratic and therefore more normal trading partner of the members of this international order. And the Chinese Communist Party, apparently, in retrospect, never had any intention of doing so. So that's one area where the scales are tilted very heavily in favor of Chinese industries in ways that simply don't occur, whether it's Google, as you mentioned, or Bosch in Germany, or other industrial manufacturers or technology companies. The Chinese simply ignore the way we do business in the West and have engaged in outright deceit and theft to attain global status as opposed to earning it, which is the way companies are supposed to earn that status in the West and around the world.
Here's a question from the audience, if I may, and it relates to something I think you both can respond on. So Gary, I'll ask you to respond first. The Great Cold War with the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, was really won because the competition with the United States ruined their economy, and they simply could not keep up. This was a strategy that we pursued. It was effective, and by 1989 it worked. In this case, though, China's economy will soon be as large and then larger than the United States. So that gambit may not work as well. Having lived through that, Gary, do you think there's an economic wild card that gives us any kind of an advantage in maintaining a power balance and or keeping China in check? Your thoughts?
Well, the whole Russian thing, was interesting because obviously we all were living under fear of this Russian threat. We all had the drills where you have to go under your desk and put your hands over your head, and everyone thought about building their own bomb shelter. Um, and then now, when you look at some of it, and of course, we thought the Russians were crazy. And then you go back and you look, well, Nikita Khrushchev thought Kennedy was crazy, and everybody thought Reagan was going to bomb the hell out of them. So there was a misunderstanding on both sides. And I'm not even close to defending the Russians, but the Russians never had a strong economy. When you look at the statistic that John put up, you see, China, the US, Germany, Japan. Russia's a tiny little piece of the international economy, and it always was. And so, yeah, it fell apart through its own weight and through its own inability to function. And there were a lot of reasons why the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War followed suit. John, what do you think?
Yeah, no, you raise a very important point here, Gary. Russia was a weak economy. It never sought to become wealthy, and maybe that was just a more rigid adherence to Marxist Leninist thought. Whereas Deng Xiaoping, when he succeeded Mao Zedong in the late 1970s, he wasn't as committed to communist ideology as to the sense that if China became a wealthy country, it could attain a level of power on the global stage that simply eluded the Soviet Union. And then it could also use that wealth to build a very powerful army, a very powerful military, to be able to establish geopolitical dominance on the Asian continent and across Eurasia. And even though that strategy is 40 years old, it's played out very, very skillfully on the part of the Chinese. And today we're dealing with, I think, a very different type of challenge than we faced against the Soviet Union for half a century. The one good thing I will say so far is that we're now dealing with a country that has the massive nuclear arsenal the Soviet Union had, where at one point they had 38,000 nuclear warheads. The Chinese to date have maybe 300 to 500, but they are building up their nuclear arsenal. And so the one area that we hope we don't replicate from the Cold War with the Soviet Union is a nuclear arms race with China. But it may not even be very important because the Chinese government is determined to build a very powerful space force to be able to knock out all of our satellites, to destroy our communications, our GPS systems, and the like. And so what was once a nuclear arms race between the US and the Soviet Union may become a technological space arms race involving satellite systems.
I'm going to ask you guys what I'd call 2 lightning round questions from the audience, and then I'm afraid we have to adjourn. Just a note to the audience is a bunch of us will be on Facebook. If you go to our Facebook page, we're going to have a watch party, and we're going to watch the debate. And all opinions, all comments, all jokes are welcome if you want to join us. Anyway, these 2 lightning round questions I'm going to ask now from the audience, but we only have time for quick answers. The first is, China has a different political system and a different system of governance. And in as much as it maintains that governance and it has created so much of an educated middle class compared to where it was 40 years ago, that is a good thing. So is there anything inherent in the communist system or in what we might consider to be a totalitarian system within its own borders or even within maybe its own local sphere that is inherently bad or negative compared to us and the industrialized world and our allies, which are more of a free market, democratic society? I don't know how you can do that in a minute, but give it a try. And Gary, want to hear from you too.
So I'll go first then. I think a lot of what you're referring to here, Brian, is the reason why China today is the inheritor of a great Confucian civilization that dates back thousands of years. And it has laid out a culture and a philosophy that is duly respectful of authority, that tends to be quite patriarchal in nature, but also prizes order over freedom. So you don't have the same sense of respect for the individual and human rights in China as you do for the necessity of the order of the empire once upon a time and the order of the state. And now you overlay on top of that the Leninist ideology, and it gives you a very different, a very unique political system that has a very distinct Confucian background and roots, but a terrifying Leninist ideology that is 1984 on steroids in terms of the surveillance state that China has not only imposed on its own people, but is exporting to countries around the world.
I see. So it's really not only is that Leninist, that sort of 1984 state they've created within their own borders, but they're imposing it on a lot of their allies and those countries who become debtors to them. That's very interesting. Gary, do you have a thought about sort of the danger of a totalitarian or a 1984 style Leninist state existing in the second largest economy and soon the largest economy in the globe?
There are a lot of people who think we have that same kind of problem here, Brian. So,
Yeah.
but I guess my comment on that would be our strength has to come from ourselves, and we don't have to. The moment, I don't think we have to worry as much about foreign threats as we do about public discourse in this country. I mean, we all hear exactly what we want to hear. You know, we listen to the same news stations, right or left. We don't listen to anything else. We don't talk to each other. There doesn't appear to be common ground. And social media and media in general is just exacerbating that. And our strength, and that is a threat to our strength. So if you look at what we can do to be effective at dealing with the Russian threat, the Chinese threat, the economic threat anywhere else, it's to be strong internally and to be able to deal with each other on a far more rational and objective basis than we're dealing now. I mean, we are so polarized now. That's what I see as the biggest threat to us. Yeah, we have external threats, but if we can't get our act together and act together cooperatively to deal with these threats, then we're in trouble.
Well, I think that's a great note on which to end. I have a couple quick announcements to make. I want to thank you, John, for coming from DC and giving us this talk that you have put together so professionally. And you too, Gary. You're both very strong writers and observers, and we're going to publish your talks in text as well as in video. I think it's up to us. So I think focusing on Gary's question, if we really want to create a better free and democratic society, we need to engage in polite and civil discourse. And we need to see both sides, and we need to not fall into this polarization. So let's try to be more open with each other.